In the aftermath of Rome's ascendancy in the Western Mediterranean, the balance of power that had been precariously maintained since the First Punic War began to unravel. The locus of tension was the Iberian Peninsula, where Carthage, under the Barcid dynasty, sought to rebuild its strength. Hannibal, following in the designs of his father Hamilcar and brother-in-law Hasdrubal, took command in Iberia and initiated a campaign that would challenge Rome's entire strategic framework. At the heart of this escalation stood Saguntum, a wealthy and fortified city located south of the Ebro River. Though not formally allied to Rome by treaty, Saguntum had received Roman assurances of support and was effectively considered a client or protectorate. Hannibal, recognizing its political alignment as a threat to Carthaginian interests, besieged the city around 219 BCE. The action was bold but not irrational. It was, in effect, a test of Roman resolve. Rome's response was one of diplomatic assertion. It dispatched envoys demanding Hannibal's withdrawal and his extradition for violating the spirit, if not the letter, of the Ebro Treaty signed in 226 BC. This treaty had limited Carthaginian expansion north of the river, but Saguntum's location south of it provided Hannibal with a legalistic shield. Carthage, unwilling to abandon its most capable general and reluctant to cede influence in Spain, rejected Rome's demands. Mommsen frames this episode as more than a legal or diplomatic rupture. It was, fundamentally, the collapse of the post-First Punic War order. Both powers had been preparing for renewed conflict. Rome had consolidated its Italian hegemony and extended its influence into Illyria and beyond. Carthage had built a new economic base in Spain and restored military credibility. The siege of Saguntum, therefore, was not merely an act of aggression. It was the trigger of a war long in the making, one that would soon engulf the Italian peninsula, Spain, Africa, and eventually, the fate of both republics. Rome entered the Second Punic War with assumptions rooted in the precedent of the First. The Senate believed the principal theaters of conflict would be Spain and Africa, zones where Rome could leverage its superior naval logistics and control of Sicily. Preparations were accordingly structured. One consular army under Gnaeus Scipio was dispatched to Iberia to cut off Carthaginian expansion, while another force under Tiberius Sempronius Longus was directed toward Africa for a potential amphibious offensive. The Roman high command underestimated Hannibal's strategic calculus and failed to consider the possibility of a full-scale invasion of Italy itself. Hannibal, assessing the political geography of the Western Mediterranean, acted with an unorthodox boldness that Rome was unprepared to counter. Rather than defend Carthaginian holdings in Spain or await Roman encroachment in Africa, he struck where Rome was most confident, on its home soil. His crossing of the Alps in late 218 BCE with an army composed of Iberians, Libyans, and a corps of elephants was not simply a military operation. It was an act of strategic redefinition. Mommsen emphasizes that Hannibal's march circumvented the established theaters of Roman control. The Alps had long been viewed as a natural barrier, imposing, inhospitable, and impractical for the transit of large forces. Roman commanders had not seriously contemplated that an enemy would attempt to breach them with an entire army. Yet Hannibal, enduring frostbite, skirmishes with mountain tribes, and staggering attrition, brought his core forces into Cisalpine Gaul, where Gallic tribes, already discontented with Roman rule, welcomed him as a liberator. The Republic was stunned. The war, which had been expected to unfold abroad, now threatened Rome's northern frontier. Italy, secure for nearly a century, was abruptly transformed into the central theater of a war that Rome had believed would be fought far from the city's gates. Hannibal had nullified Rome's initial war plan before a single major engagement was fought. This miscalculation would cost the Republic dearly in the years to come. Rome's first encounters with Hannibal on Italian soil revealed the catastrophic implications of its strategic misjudgment. The initial clash came at the Ticinus River in late 218 BCE. It was a cavalry engagement, small in scale but symbolically enormous. Hannibal's Numidian and Iberian horsemen decisively routed the Roman cavalry led by Publius Cornelius Scipio, who was gravely wounded and barely rescued from the field, an act later ascribed to his young son, the future Scipio Africanus. The engagement shattered Roman confidence in their superiority, particularly in mounted warfare. Only days later came the Battle of the Trebia, where Hannibal orchestrated the first of his great set-piece victories. There, he lured the Roman consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus into attacking his position across a freezing river at dawn, after withholding food and rest from the legions. Hidden in ambush near the Roman flank were troops led by Hannibal's brother Mago. As the Roman infantry became bogged down midstream and pressed into the Carthaginian line, Mago's forces struck from the rear. The resulting double assault decimated the Roman forces. Thousands were slain or driven into the icy river. The Roman army was not merely beaten, it was tactically humiliated. Then, in the spring of 217 BCE, came the most audacious ambush of the campaign, Lake Trasimene. Gaius Flaminius, reckless and driven by political motives, rushed north without proper reconnaissance to intercept Hannibal's forces as they crossed Etruria. Hannibal feigned a retreat, positioning his army along a wooded ridge beside the lake. As Flaminius's army marched into the narrow defile, Carthaginian infantry and cavalry crashed down from the hills, cutting off escape routes and collapsing the Roman columns. The entire army was either slain or captured. Flaminius himself was killed in the fighting. Mommsen treats these defeats not merely as military failures, but as revelations of Roman institutional rigidity. The Roman command structure, with its short-term magistracies and emphasis on direct confrontation, proved inadequate against Hannibal's adaptive tactics. In less than a year, 3 engagements had cost Rome tens of thousands of men and demonstrated that the Italian heartland was defenseless in the face of a general who understood not just battlefield maneuvers, but the psychology of Roman command. The war had ceased to be a contest of states. It had become a confrontation between a republic and a military genius. In the aftermath of Lake Trasimene, panic gripped the Roman Senate. Italy lay open to Hannibal's movements, and traditional military methods had yielded only catastrophe. In this crisis, the Senate turned to an extraordinary measure, the appointment of a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus. His approach departed radically from Roman custom. Where others sought immediate confrontation, Fabius chose to exhaust the enemy through attrition. Fabius refused battle. Instead, he shadowed Hannibal at a distance, denying him supplies, harassing his foragers, and cutting access to Roman markets. This was not cowardice, but strategic recalibration. Fabius recognized that Hannibal's strength lay not merely in battlefield maneuver, but in the psychological dislocation he inflicted on Rome's political and military institutions. By avoiding large-scale engagements, Fabius preserved Roman manpower and stretched Hannibal's logistics in hostile territory. Hannibal, for his part, attempted to provoke the Romans into combat by ravaging Italian countryside, sparing only the estates of Fabius himself to cast suspicion upon the dictator's motives. Within Rome, Fabius's policy was derided. He earned the nickname Cunctator, the delayer, a title meant in scorn, not honor. The public, chafing under the humiliation of inaction, demanded an offensive posture. Fabius's cautious strategy, though effective in slowing Hannibal's momentum, stood in stark contrast to Rome's traditional martial ethos. Mommsen interprets Fabius's dictatorship as a moment of institutional clarity, a republic capable of rethinking its methods, of subordinating glory to endurance. Though politically vulnerable and unpopular, Fabius laid the structural foundation for long-term resistance. His delay allowed for reorganization of the army, reconstitution of alliances, and the gradual realization that Hannibal could be resisted, not with single decisive battles, but with time, resources, and strategic patience. In 216 BCE, Rome committed to a policy of decisive engagement, abandoning the cautious strategies of Fabius Maximus. 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, commanded a massive army, estimated at over 80,000 infantry and cavalry, the largest force Rome had ever assembled to that date. Their target was Hannibal, camped near Cannae in the Apulian plain. The objective was clear: to destroy the Carthaginian army and end the war in a single stroke. Hannibal, fully aware of Roman intentions, orchestrated what would become one of the most studied military engagements in history. He arranged his forces in a convex formation, light Iberian and Gallic infantry in the center, with seasoned African troops on the wings. His cavalry, superior in both mobility and command, was placed on the flanks. As the Romans advanced in dense formation, pressing into the center, Hannibal's infantry yielded gradually, bending inward without breaking. Meanwhile, his cavalry, under Hasdrubal, routed the Roman horse and encircled the infantry from behind. The Roman legions, tightly packed and unable to maneuver, were enveloped on all sides. The slaughter was methodical. At least 50,000 Romans died on the field. Some estimates placed the toll as high as 70,000. Paulus was killed, along with most of the senior officers and both consular quaestors. It was an annihilation without precedent, a complete destruction of a Roman army in open battle. In its aftermath, Hannibal refrained from marching on Rome, a decision that has long divided historians. Mommsen interprets this not as hesitation but as prudence. Hannibal lacked siege equipment, and Rome was heavily fortified. Instead, he turned to a political strategy intended to unravel Rome's alliances and encourage defections. Cities such as Capua, Tarentum, and several Bruttian and Lacanian communities opened their gates to him. Rome's response was severe and uncompromising. There would be no negotiations, no peace proposals. The Senate executed officers who had survived by surrendering. Citizens who advocated for capitulation were silenced or exiled. The state reorganized itself for total war. Property was taxed, slaves were enlisted, and new legions were raised, including boys under the usual age for service. Despite the disaster, or perhaps because of it, the Republic committed to fight not for victory alone, but for survival. Mommsen underscores that Cannae did not break Rome. It clarified its resolve. The Republic, stripped of military confidence, turned instead to institutional resilience. What Hannibal had achieved on the battlefield, he could not translate into political collapse. Cannae was not the end. It was the threshold of a war that would be decided not by genius, but by endurance. While Hannibal maintained his presence in southern Italy, exacting tribute from defected cities and attempting to fracture Rome's alliance network, the Republic began to reassert its strength on a distant front. The war in Hispania, originally intended as a diversion, evolved into the fulcrum of Roman recovery. There, the Scipio brothers, Gnaeus and Publius, initiated campaigns to isolate Carthaginian power from its Iberian base of recruitment and finance. Initially, their efforts were met with success. Roman forces won several engagements and managed to contain Hannibal's reinforcements from reaching Italy. However, in 211 BCE, both brothers were killed in separate actions, and Carthage briefly regained momentum in Spain. The situation might have collapsed were it not for the sudden rise of Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the fallen consul at Ticinus, now in his early 20s. Scipio was elected to command the Roman forces in Spain, a remarkable appointment, given his youth and lack of formal seniority. But his campaign would radically shift the balance of the war. In 209 BCE, Scipio launched a surprise assault on Carthago Nova, the administrative and logistical hub of Carthaginian Spain. The city was taken swiftly, and its vast arsenals, ships, and hostages were captured. This stroke not only deprived Carthage of its most fortified base, but also won the allegiance of many Iberian tribes who had previously wavered. Mommsen highlights Scipio's approach as revolutionary, not merely militarily, but diplomatically. He treated defeated tribes with clemency, paid troops punctually, and cultivated loyalty through calculated magnanimity. In a context where Carthaginian rule had often been exploitative, Rome began to appear as a preferable hegemon. Over the following years, Scipio fought and defeated both Hasdrubal Barca and Mago, systematically dismantling the Barcid network in Spain. By 206 BCE, Rome had expelled Carthage entirely from the Iberian Peninsula. With the loss of Spain, Carthage was deprived of vital silver mines, tax revenues, and a major recruitment zone. The strategic implications were decisive. Hannibal, isolated in Italy and unable to receive substantial reinforcements, was now fighting a war of attrition without a viable base of supply. Scipio's campaigns demonstrated that Rome's strength no longer resided solely in its traditional infantry formations or senatorial commands. It now possessed commanders who could think on a global scale, wage psychological as well as physical war, and reshape the imperial landscape not merely by conquest, but by the construction of alternative loyalties. The war was shifting, and Scipio was preparing for its final act. With Spain secured and Carthaginian influence dismantled west of the Mediterranean, Scipio pressed the Senate to approve an invasion of Africa, a maneuver that would bring the war directly to Carthage's homeland and force a reckoning. Though cautious, the Senate eventually sanctioned the expedition in 204 BCE, sending Scipio with a modest force to Utica. This was no mere raid. It was a calculated campaign aimed at shifting the theater of war, compelling Hannibal's recall from Italy and dictating the terms of peace. In Africa, Scipio demonstrated not only battlefield acumen but political foresight. He allied with Massinissa, a Numidian prince whose cavalry would prove decisive in the coming engagements. The Carthaginian state, increasingly divided and desperate, recalled Hannibal from Italy, ending his 16-year presence on the peninsula. His return to Africa was strategic but fraught. He faced a homeland weakened by war, a military reduced in quality, and a political class fragmented by decades of strain. The final confrontation came in 202 BCE at Zama, inland from Carthage. Hannibal fielded an army composed in part of newly levied African recruits, or elephants, and a cavalry contingent inferior to that of his earlier Italian campaigns. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's tactics at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, prepared his formations to withstand and neutralize a frontal assault. He left gaps in his lines to funnel and dissipate the charge of the elephants, turning them into liabilities rather than assets. Once the elephants were dealt with, Scipio's Roman infantry engaged Hannibal's center, while Massinissa's Numidian cavalry routed the Carthaginian horse and struck from the rear, echoing Hannibal's own encirclement tactics at Cannae. The result was a decisive Roman victory. Casualties on the Carthaginian side were immense. The army was broken and irrecoverable. Mommsen presents Zama not as a mere military triumph, but as the strategic consummation of Roman endurance and transformation. The war concluded not because Carthage was overrun, but because it could no longer command the resources, alliances, or tactical superiority that had once sustained Hannibal's campaign. The peace treaty imposed in 201 BCE stripped Carthage of its fleet, its empire, and its autonomy in foreign policy. Rome imposed a crippling indemnity and forbade any future war without Roman consent. Scipio was awarded the title Africanus, his name forever tied to the defeat of Rome's most dangerous enemy. But the greater legacy lay in what Rome had become, a power that could win wars not only by resilience, but by strategic vision, by projecting force across seas, and by turning once distant theaters, Spain, Africa, into instruments of imperial consolidation. The defeat of Hannibal marked the ascendancy of a Rome that would now define Mediterranean order for centuries to come. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.